because when you just look at the news, you just see people screaming at one another,
Yeah.
right? It's like left versus right, black versus white. And the reality is it's murky, right? What I love about being a scholarship and being at Vanderbilt is like we explore the gray, right?
Right.
There's outside the world, you have like it's black versus white, red versus blue, like it's very dichotomous. But like the reality of our world is that, as you know, it's complex, it's nuanced.
Today, we are thrilled to introduce a true expert in political science and data-driven analysis, Josh Clinton. Josh is the Abby and John Winklereed Chair and Professor of Political Science at Vanderbilt University, where he serves as co-director of both the Vanderbilt Poll and the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. He's also an executive committee member for Vanderbilt's Data Science Institute, bringing a rigorous data perspective to some of the most pressing issues in politics and governance. Welcome to Quantum Potential, a podcast dedicated to curiosity and discovery. My name is Cybele Raver, and I serve as the Provost of Vanderbilt University. As a leader in higher education and as a social scientist, I believe that we can transform higher education for the 21st century. At my core, I am wildly curious about other people's work, whether it's in science, the social sciences, the humanities, or the arts. This podcast gives us the opportunity to break open new ideas through discovery and creative expression. A two-time Emmy-nominated senior election analyst for NBC News, Josh is responsible for making election night projections, blending deep analytical skill with real-time insights. His impressive academic and professional credentials include a PhD in political science, an MS in statistics, and a BA in economics from Stanford University. He's also been a key figure in the American Association of Public Opinion Research, leading task forces on pre-election polling and contributing to critical analyses of election polling methods. Josh's research covers the dynamics of elections, public opinion, political institutions, and lawmaking, grounded in advanced statistical methods. With a career that spans rigorous academic scholarship and high-stakes media analysis, Josh brings unparalleled expertise to today's conversation. Josh, thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for that overly ambitious explanation of my past. But it's a real pleasure to be here and being at Vanderbilt. I'm looking forward to it.
You earned it.
I don't know about
Professor Clinton. We'll talk about your past and your present. But at first, I just want to say you play such an amazing role, not just here at Vanderbilt, but in America, because you are the senior election analyst for NBC News. You are literally the person who projects the winner of our national elections, as well as conducting polls about how and why people vote both before and after elections. So first, from my perspective, as a person who loves this country and loves democracy, I really want to thank you for everything you do. And second, I have a million questions about how that works, what it's like. Our election last week must have been the culmination of weeks and months of intense work and teaching as you help the rest of our country figure out our choices in voting for our nation's leaders. And as you safeguard not just voting, but our trust in polling and trust in voting. I'm going to just pass it over to you, but just wanted to highlight that in a recent talk you gave for C-SPAN, you talked about how we as Americans love scores and following scores, even political scores, like statistics about who might win. We love following the results of polls, and at the same time, our polls can get it so wrong. And you gave this great example from 1936 in the run-up to the presidential election between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and a candidate I'd never heard of before, to be honest, named Landon.
Landon, yeah.
And that the polls had predicted overwhelmingly the likelihood of Landon winning based on the view that it was time for a change, but yet Roosevelt won by a landslide. So I'll kick it over to you, Josh, but I just loved that example and how you were really teaching us to think about polls and data.
Yeah, well, it's one of these things that, what I love about my job is that not only do I get to immerse myself in like the real world and not just the ivory tower, but then also more importantly, try to convey that to the students at Vanderbilt, but then also citizens around the world. And I think the world that we live in now today, that you can't step 3 feet without getting hit by some number, right? And both sides have got their own numbers. And,
totally.
And the whole notion of what the truth is and how we understand those numbers is really, really critical. And it's also a lot of it's untested. Like, you say, I can 48.7% this, but like, understand the numbers, like what that means, where it comes from, the type of biases that might be there, and kind of who's trying to tell you those numbers. It's such a critically important skill to understand like where the world is, like what it looks like descriptively, but then also like how we make our way as citizens of the world. And like, Vanderbilt students trying to teach them how to navigate those numbers. So when they're future leaders and when they're leaders now, frankly, right, how can they get the right decisions that they, data they need to make decisions? And then also, I think instilling with them, I think one thing about that data that is really important, although a lot of people lose sight of this, is the absolute humility that you need when you work with data, right? Because when you do polling, like you will be wrong more often than right. I mean, there's an unescapable error. Like even if you do things perfectly, and that's true with most things in life, but like you've got this weird disjunction where you can quantify something and it feels really, really certain, right? And really, really precise. But then if you take that and you can overinterpret what that means, and we do that all the time as human beings, like you're very certain about something without having the humility of understanding, well, that number is a result of a bunch of processes, both stated and unstated. Unless you have a full understanding of what that means, like you're likely to kind of make it very, very wrong. Like that 1936 poll, like they interviewed like 2.4 million people in 1936.
5.5%.
Which is crazy.
Right?
Like most pollsters would kill for a poll that large. And they got it like massively wrong, right?
Yeah.
And even nowadays you see pollsters having massive polls. And in 2024, like the polls got it better than 2020, but close, but no cigar, right? They still didn't really fully pick up the shift towards Trump that pollsters have been struggling with. And so
I love that you're trying to get to that, right? That there's this way in which we use numbers. I certainly, as a leader, I use numbers. I love numbers. I want to see evidence of the benefit of what we're doing or the benefit of what we've invested in, right? Yep. But I love that you also use that frame of humility and also sort of expansion of people's not only understanding of numbers, but empowerment through numbers, right? Like don't get caught into believing a number just because somebody said it, but come to understand how that number was generated, push back.
And also like on that point, that the scoring numbers, like we love to know the score, right? And so we're always tracking metrics, right? And so sometimes we get obsessed with metrics that don't really mean anything, right? But like there's something to follow. Like I need to tell a story. And so the election is like one giant story of us following some number that has no real connection to what necessarily is what's going to happen on election day. But every single beeb and wav, it kind of like gets blown out of proportion. Like the night before, like there was the Iowa Seltzer poll. And so like, depending on what network you were watching, right, they spent like 48 hours talking about like one number, which was ludicrous if you think about it. So, I mean, you think about a conventional, pre-election polling nowadays. And so like the average state level poll is 800 people. So to get 800 people, a pollster needs to call 40,000 people. Wow. Right. So right off the bat, you got a problem because the 800 people you talk to are abnormal relative to the 39,200 people who did not. Right. So right now, you as a pollster, you've got this problem. Right. And so I'm talking to people. I know they're weird because they're talking to a pollster. Right. And then you've got the second problem where I need to make them look
like generous.
Yeah. That's right. They're generous. They're kind of like
they're willing.
They're willing to talk to, which again is great if you're a pollster, but then also like if you're trying to capture the electorate. Right, where some of the electorate may not want to talk to pollsters, right, given the nature of our political discourse, then you've got a real problem. And the problem is that then as a pollster, you need to start making decisions about how you make those 800 people look like what you think the electorate's going to look like, which you don't know, right, because it hasn't happened yet. And so again, you're basically introducing art in some sense, right, or judgment or discretion by the part of a pollster to try to make what's a scientific process, like random sampling with no non-response, that, science is good on that. But what we actually do in the real world is not really closely tied to science like at all.
Right. And you're shaping, but not cooking.
Exactly.
Right? It's such an interesting sort of, and what are the breaks on that set of decisions? Is it largely because you just, logistically don't have enough time to keep getting the model more and more perfect when you're trying to figure out how to make those 800 people represent the 49,000, 200 people that, or 39,000, whatever the number was, right? Yeah. Or is it just that you know that there's a ripcord that you pull that says this is as far as I'm willing to go, and trying to figure out how to analytically shift and shape so that you feel like you get the right enough answer. How do you make that judgment?
Well, I think everyone makes it differently. And part of the problem is in that there's not transparency, right? And so if you see a number from a pollster, they've done a lot of decision making that you have no idea what that is, right? Where they just like, I wanted this result to show Trump +2, right? Or did they try to make a best effort to try to do what the reality was? But like some of that error is inescapable, right? No one actually knows what the electorate's going to look like, right? And after 2016 and 2020, a lot of the pollsters said, well, we struggle a lot to get Republicans, in particular Trump-supporting Republicans, to take our surveys. And so that, I led the task force that kind of analyzed pre-election polling and said, well, this is a real problem for polling. But to be honest, I'm not sure there is a solution, and we can see what happens. And so what pollsters then try to do is you look at your sample and you try to make it look like the demographics of the electorate. But what's that look like? No one has any idea, right? I know what 2020
and I love
looked like.
that you started addressing that, right? By saying new voters could potentially look really different in different states.
Exactly.
Right. So by the virtue of age and, massive shifts in birth rates 20 years ago, and who's here in the United States today, it may be different than who was here in the United States and voting 20 years earlier.
And then the candidates themselves, right? You have concerts and get out the vote efforts. And so are young people going to show up, or old people, are they going to be crossover voters? And so that's all unknowable, right? And it's all foundationally unknowable. But as a pollster, if you put out one number, you're making a lot of decisions that aren't really being communicated. And so I did this work. I just took a poll that was, I commissioned for part of the work I'm doing in my Carnegie project. And just wanted to see, if I wanted to be a pre-election pollster, which to be clear, I do not, right? But if I wanted to, what were the set decisions that I'd have to make to try to make this to model what the electorate is? And the reality is depending upon the answers that I was willing to make, I could move the top line Harris-Trump margin by 8 percentage points.
Wow.
Right. And so that's decisions that I, as a pollster, trying to not bias it, but trying to just do a straight up read. But how do you account for partisanship, or how do you account for the demographics? And you can make reasonable assumptions to make tremendous variation. And now that's above and beyond just the other randomness that's going on. And so now you're talking about, all right, so we have an entire media apparatus talking about who's going to win Michigan, right? Which best case scenario, it's a 2 percentage point. And you're trying to use a pre-election poll to do that. But the decisions you can make can move that number 8%. And so it's like a surgeon trying to do surgery with a butter knife. You can get close, right? You can cut out an organ, but it's not going to be pretty, right? It's not.
And so in that project, and congratulations, by the way, the Carnegie Fellowship is incredibly prestigious. We're thrilled. I'm thrilled as the university's provost that you won that award and that you have that kind of support to do that work. When you're doing that kind of work, how do you sort of unpack the level of complexity around polarization and trust? One of the things that you've pointed out is that if increasingly we become polarized as a nation, we have lower and lower trust in the processes and the information that we exchange to make these really important decisions.
No, that's great. And that's something that keeps me up at night. One of the many things is trying to figure out what that means, right? Because we know that you have this problem with pre-election polling and people who take our polls, right? And that's a generic problem that's just not pre-election polling, right? But as someone who does the Vanderbilt poll, for example, it's something that we struggle with. How do we make sure that we're counting the right people in a state like Tennessee, right? So we can kind of reflect what the public opinion in the small d democratic way is, right? That's absolutely foundational because polling has such an important role to play, because otherwise we're just listening to the voices on Twitter and the streets, which, are loud, but not necessarily reflective of the overall population. So, what we try to do is normal polling is a little bit better situated than pre-election polling, because I don't need to make this assumption that I don't need to try to figure out what the election may or may not be. I know what the population looks like. I know what registered voters look like, but that doesn't really fully get out around the problem that, if someone doesn't trust the media and doesn't trust polls, you're not having their viewpoint, right, in your survey, right? And so then that requires more complex things to try to figure out, do you have any of them, right, in the view, right? So can you drive down their views a little bit more? But then also kind of more generally, this thing I struggle with, honestly, is how much of this is in some sense performative, right? And so when people say, and this is I don't know how much to trust sometimes the polling that says people, they don't trust the election results, right, in that States. And so that's what my project is looking at. And so it's looking at differences between where you live, because now we're increasingly geographically sorted. And so you're a red state or blue state. And not only do you live in a red state or blue state, but increasingly how you vote is very different between red states and blue states. And so our democracy and the rules of our democracy, because of federalism, vary, very tremendously, but our national elections are like wicked tight, right? Using a technical term, right? So like the House is very close, the presidency is real close, the Senate's really close. And so like we've got these really, really close elections being decided by people living in politically uncompetitive areas, voting using very different voting regimes.
Yeah.
And so that's not a great recipe for legitimacy.
And we're huge,
and
right?
we're huge,
we're not
right?
a small country.
And we're not huge, and we're in a variety, diversity of opinions and experiences and, and opinions. And so of everything. And so how do you put that all together, right, in this messy pot called the United States and kind of get a democracy and get legitimacy in the outcome when, people vote differently? And so I can't say that I have the answer. I can't promise I'll have the answer at the end of my investigation, but I hope to get a little bit closer to kind of see what are the tensions there, what are some points of commonality, because when you just look at the news, if insofar as it is news, like you just see people screaming at one another, right? It's like left versus right, black versus white. And the reality is it's murky, right? What I love about being a scholarship and being at Vanderbilt is like we explore the gray, right?
Right.
There's outside the world, you have like it's black versus white, red versus blue, like it's very dichotomous. But like the reality of our world is that, as you know, it's like it's complex, it's nuanced.
When you're thinking about polarization and being in a very highly local context compared to being in a national context, your description of growing up in Stittsville, New York, my dad for a while was in Ogdensburg, New York. I lived, in Ithaca, where I traveled through a lot of upstate counties that look nothing like what I grew up in terms of 96 and Madison and Manhattan, right? And that those two could both be in the state of New York, or that two places, I didn't know before I got here that Middle Tennessee was Middle Tennessee, which is totally different than Knoxville and totally different than Memphis, right? Yeah. So the extent to which, your own experience being in a community and in a household with loving parents who hadn't themselves had the opportunity to be in college, I just think a lot about how willing and open you are to, as you said, be humble in the face of what you know and what you don't know about other people's opinions. And I thought I'd just ask you to talk a little bit about that and how you ended up where you are now.
I have no idea. So I mean, like, I'm just very lucky and grateful for the opportunities I had. So, I mean, I grew up in Stittsville, New York, which is like 1,000 people. My mom was a registered nurse. My dad dropped out of community college to be a land surveyor before he was laid off in the 90s or whatever. And so that convinced me I didn't really want to work for corporate America because that was a searing experience. But I had no idea what college was. Watching TV. Most of my college, I went to a community college or joined the family farm or joined the military. I just happened to be good in social studies because I like debate. And so I thought, well, maybe you'll be a lawyer then because LA law and all that stuff. And so, looking back, I'm horrified, especially having just gone through this ginormous and ridiculously process with my son last year. But applying for college, I applied to Michigan State because I did well on my PSAT score. And so they said, come take a scholarship. And so my parents got in a car because I think I was on the airplane once. And so we drove across the country to Michigan to take a multiple choice test, which I did not do well. So I didn't get a scholarship there. So there I stopped and kind of toured the University of Michigan and they kind of Wolverines like that because I liked the movie Red Dawn when I was a kid. But didn't get in there either. I applied to the Cornell, the state school, Industrial and Labor Relations, because a kid in my high school who was my idol, because I was a freshman, he was a senior on the debate team. And so he went there and it was a state school. And so as a New York State, I could afford that part. But, got denied early decision. Every point of the way I got kind of denied there. So I still have a little grudge about that. But, chips are good, I guess, on your shoulder. But the last day, I also won this Xerox Award from the University of Rochester as the best social studies student. And my friend won the Bosch Shalom's a science one and said, Josh, you applying here? He's like, where's that? No, I don't, because I'm going to go to Cornell. I had the hat. I was all in. That was my dream school that I was going to go to. And Rochester, no. But then he said, well, they waived your application fee. And so literally the last day, I get out a pen because this is the day you had typewriters. I'm aging myself. And I had all my other applications that were with typewritten errors or whatever. But this one I did in blue pen, sent it off and kind of got accepted. And it turns out at the end of the day, that's the only place I got in besides Michigan State. And so I don't know what I would have been done. And so I went there. Right. And it was interesting because they had a preview weekend there. And I remember being there and when everyone else was hearing about the Ivy League admissions and everyone else was getting in other Ivies and said, we're not going to Rochester. And I realized that I got denied. I was well, this is my home now. This is where I'm going to be. And
that's right.
In retrospect, it was the very, very best but like to just give you a sense of like how crazy I was. Like I wanted to go to WashU because they sent me a Cadillac and had a castle on the front. And as a kid growing up, like I love castles and dragons. And my parents said, no, you can't go there. It's too far and we can't afford it. But like anyway, that was like the level of thinking that I was engaged in, right? Like totally not, right? Professionalized. I didn't have it was just like insane. And so I ended up at Rochester, thought I was going to be a lawyer. I had no idea what that lawyer was until I talked to one of my friends who basically was from Manhattan, an intern for a lawyer. And so their life actually is not great, right? Because they're on the call all the time. It's like, well, I said, you don't get to argue? Like, that's what I loved about it. Like, no, it turns out, no, you get to have the billable hours. That's what you did.
So be a political scientist,
Well,
Josh.
So like, where's that come from? Like,
argue with people.
Argue with people, that's right. Do data
in
stuff.
In political science.
No, but I took a political philosophy class, and I remember I still have the paper, and it said, like, you have a talent for abstract analytical thinking, cultivate it. And so that was my professor, Jim Johnson. I took as a sophomore, and I had this like summer experience, which is something why I love the immersion Vanderbilt experience, because that literally changed my life. And so I said, I've got this $3,000. Last year summer I worked at a summer camp. Like I'm not sure what I'm going to do this summer. And he said, well, you can just work with me. And so he let me kind of read some obscure philosopher or whatever, and kind of like go deep and I just loved it. It's not what I do now.
That's just so wild. I mean, listen to the data points you just reeled off, right? The cover of the university brochure, right?
I was not a sophisticated thinker.
No, but like just for what kids or what any individual has right now to figure out making a huge decision about whether they can go to college and where to go to college if they can go to college, right? So, that your parents were willing to drive you to take a test, which you subsequently didn't do well enough on. Yeah. And yet you had a friend who convinced you to apply on the last day of the application.
I know.
And then that you figured out your career because a professor took on that incredible opportunity and responsibility of mentoring you. Like what an amazing set of data points that lead you to a PhD from Stanford. It's just wild.
No, I think this is like something, it's that, being aware that, it takes work to get where you are, but it also takes luck, right? And and so I think like just being humble and, because you appreciate like, I am here, but for like a few decisions that went the other way, and like, who knows what would be the outcome. And so that's good and bad, right? And so, but it's also, I think, it kind of grounds you, I think, in a really, important way. Like I have no idea, like where I was going to be when I started, college. And even when I started grad school, I started doing something other than what I ended up doing. It's just like.
And do you see versions of yourself or versions of who you might have been had not you gone to take those steps in your data for other constituencies or other voters or other groups of people who are, do not have PhDs from incredibly elite private universities, but who, also did well in high school and didn't have a college education, right? Like, do you see yourself sometimes in the data, or do you see who your friends are or who your parents were, or, that way in which you have a clear sort of sanguine understanding of how diverse any data set or how diverse the people are who are represented by any data set.
I think that's right. I think like, it gets back to the point of like being overly precise, right? And so like we can quantify something, but that quantification, I think, omits the complexity that human beings are, right? Yeah. And the complexity of experiences, the diversity of experiences. And so it's always that navigation between trying to quantify something, but then also kind of give full voice to the richness of the experience. And so like, I do too many different projects. And so like I'm a colleague of mine, John Sides, and I started a project looking at the politics of higher education, because that's a hugely politicized topic nowadays. But like even the way we talk about that is like so coarse, right? College educated. Well, that doesn't mean, right? Doesn't mean what we think it means, right? The diversity of what that means is so broad. And so like even the way, so we do survey data and you ask, do you have some college or college? But like what it means to be college is, like my pathway, or the pathway some of my colleagues took in high school was like, 2 years, and that's what my brother did, 2 years community college and then transferred kind of to the local college, which is a very different experience than like a 4-year school. Right. Right. And,
or a 4-year residential school.
And, my mom had like 2 years associate's nursing degree. Right. And so like, which is, I guess, is that at some college? Like, so it's like, so like we try to reduce things to these boxes sometimes, and life isn't always fitting into neat boxes. And so that's something like, as someone who does statistics and data, like that is something that I grapple with every single day. But I also think that's the essential nature of kind of being humble, right? And kind of being aware of some of the downsides and some limitations of what you do, because like I can quantify something and I can throw it in some giant LLM or, artificial intelligence to solve the world or whatever. But like you're making a lot of reductions, right? And a lot of assumptions there, and you're coarsening the world to kind of make those inferences. And then if you're not cognizant of that, like you can end up being in a really bad place in terms of getting
you're totally convincing me that most of the time I focus on the ways in which scholarly work can generate incredible solutions to the problem, right? Whatever the problem is. But this conversation reminds me that sometimes the tools that we have can actually be driving some of the problem, that the reductive nature of quantification, that this voter is represented by either their political affiliation or by their region or by their zip code or by whether they've attained a 4-year college degree is in that moment can be potentially really reductive.
And it's super hard too, because like what does the election mean, right? I mean, everyone's kind of grappling with that. And so like, I pity you if you're on social media trying to read all the threads where people screaming at each other about like what it does or does not mean. But like, that's like such a foundationally hard thing to do to figure out, right? Because the reality is it's probably complex, right? And just because I can predict a behavior using something, does that mean that's causing that behavior? And like, we want certainty, like we want answers. And now I sound like I'm like an anti-science, but like, cause I love, this is what I do. Like I love numbers. I love quantifications and I love statistics and trying to do that. But I think it's absolutely essential for everything that we do to kind of have some semblance about like, how sure are you about that? Or if you do want to make a number, like what are the bounds of that? And not just like the statistical bounds, but then also like, where's that data come from? And like, I think sometimes we make the massive mistakes is where we don't account for that.
And right? You are also really great at saying, not only should we account for it, but we should be really transparent about it, right? Yeah. You've got this really, really great paper that focuses on the causes of mistrust and how to build it back in terms of surveying more broadly, survey data more broadly. I really love this paper because it's written for scholars and scientists, but it's also really, really readable in the sense that it's, makes complete sense, I think, to somebody who isn't in academia. And it's the title is Protecting the Integrity of Survey Research. And it's in PNAS, which is super, high level science, but written for everybody. And I thought it would be great to just have you read a little bit about why survey researchers can arrive at dissimilar conclusions. Would you be willing to just read the paragraph that I've highlighted in yellow?
Sure. Decades ago, adults in the U.S. could be reached at a particular landline phone number, and most received very few requests to participate in surveys of any kind. When they're invited to take a survey, many people agreed to do so. These assumptions no longer hold true. Cell phones have replaced landlines, and many people avoid calls from unfamiliar numbers. At the same time, even when reached by phone, some parts of the population are now much less likely to accept invitations to be interviewed than they once were. Where survey researcher was in earlier times expected to elicit answers from more than 60% of the target sample, response rates now rarely reach 10%, and nowadays it's actually like 2%. So, consequently, it's now more expensive, time-consuming, and difficult for survey research to secure the type of representative samples for which the most reputable surveys have long been known. Declining response rates and changing patterns of non-response are among the factors that affect the quality of the population estimates. It's been reported, for example, that Democrats are more likely than Republicans and independents to be agreed to be interviewed. But I think like that's all true, right? And so one solution is like, well, I don't trust any polls, therefore I'm going to give up. But I think like, and apropos of everything we talked about, like it's really hard to reduce people to a number. But I think that we can't give up on that. We just have to have the proper understanding of kind of how much uncertainty we have, because like if we don't do that, then like how do we know, right? So like the thing that polls can do is they can help make sense of like the election, for example. Like I don't know, no one knows like why voters voted for the way they did, right? All I know is that someone has supported President Trump or President Harris, right? But the reasons that they support turn out to be really important for like democratic accountability, for democratic legitimacy. I mean, if politicians think that voters intended something quite different than what they actually did, like the downstream consequences of that can be catastrophic.
So you feel like they're sending a message, voters are sending a message, but we don't know what the message is.
Yeah, and I think it's incumbent upon political scientists and kind of, to try to, in more general, to kind of figure out kind of what that message is, and that's essential, I think. I mean, politicians also, if they don't figure it out, they'll get voted out. But like But like the meaning of an election, right? The message that sends, I think is really important for understanding kind of where our country is. And polls try to give us, the best polls, like what we do in Vanderbilt polls, like no one polls in Tennessee because like it's not interesting nationally, right? It's not, that interesting statewide in terms of the elections, right? Given how solid Republican it is. But that doesn't mean that people don't have opinions about the policies that are being promulgated and kind of enacted. And a question of like, how well does the state government reflect the opinions of the people, right? Absent a poll, how would you know that, right? People who write the letters to the editor, well, that's not like normal people. And people like go on social media or protest, well, again, that's like not someone just kind of worried about going about their everyday life. And so the best thing about polls when done well is it gives that elevation of just the normal person.
I love that you also spend an equal amount of time not only trying to make the tool better and to solve the problem, but to teach us all about that. So the normal person argument, I hear you using that as shorthand for what you mean when you say representative sample. Is that right?
Yep.
So I just thought I'd ask you to explain to an audience, who's listening because they're curious, what you mean by a representative sample.
Yeah. So again, for a Vanderbilt poll, what we do is like we have a list of registered voters in Tennessee, right? So we know what that looks like demographically, age, race. And so like that gives us the basis for which we can then kind of randomly select voters. And so we can just use like just a random number generated to randomly select voters from Tennessee. Or when we do a poll from Nashville, we have a list of all the addresses in Nashville. And so we can randomly select addresses and mail them all letters to invite them to take surveys. And so on the front end, right, I at least know what the population in Tennessee or what the population of Nashville looks like broadly. And so when I get back,
if my license plate has a number 5 in it,
yeah,
and your random generator picks the number 5, and we're on the basis not of my registration, my voter registration, but my license plate,
yeah,
I might get a letter that says,
"That's right.
What is your opinion about oil and gas versus renewable energy?"
Yeah, and and then we get that opinion back, and so. We know from survey research that the people, as we talked about, who take surveys aren't necessarily reflective, right? They're kind of typically more engaged or more likely to be college educated and older, right? And so then the first task of a survey researcher after they write the question, right, is like, how do I make this reflect the population I'm interested in, right? And so this is where like I can see like, well, I've got 40% of my sample has got a college degree, but I know that's not true among registered voters in Tennessee. And so that means I need to kind of fight, count the opinions of those without a college degree more, and with those with a college degree slightly, kind of less. And so I can help do that because like I know what the state looks like, or I know what the city looks like along these kind of, demographic lines. Now that said, like it's still possible that I'm not missing, so I think the election polls in 2024, once again, probably did not get, right, supporters of President Trump who were voting but not taking polls. And will a Vanderbilt poll miss those people? Probably, right? I'm not going to lie. I mean, so then the question is like, all right, I know I've got this unavoidable error, right? And so the thing is like that, and that makes me sad, right? But I also want to kind of figure out kind of like, how do I adjust my results from that, right? So if I got this shift, that means like in a poll that we do at Vanderbilt poll, like whether it's 49 or 50, like doesn't matter to me, right? Because like the conclusions are much more, it's almost like qualitative. Like I have quantitative data to make a qualitative conclusion, which is like, is there support bipartisan or not? It's like, is there differences between the parties or not? Is there like more than a majority support, or is it evenly split? And so like, they didn't even seem like 49% supporting Governor Lee versus, 51%. I mean, the press sometimes make this up, but that's not a difference, right? That's like the same thing. That's about 50%, right? The public. But like in a pre-election poll, 49 versus 51, well, that's a big deal, right?
That's like proxy is no longer acceptable.
That's
right?
a rough proxy, exactly, right? Yeah. I need to kind of that precision where when the polling that I like doing, I don't need that precision, right? So it's kind of like, it gives me in the estimate. And so like, yeah, I could be off by a few percentage points because I don't have people, but like the type of insights that I want to draw, like people are support this policy or people hate this policy. Like it's much more qualitative.
I think the going in proposition for many people is that you're going to sample and you're going to survey to get the answer that you already know, or to get the answer to the question in the way that it benefits you, right? The sense that somehow, surveys yield something that we already kind of wanted to see.
Yeah.
But you have this great way of understanding the difference between a probability versus a non-probability sampling strategy, right? So that you get, and that the randomness of that selection that you just described earlier is another way to make sure that you get an answer that you didn't expect, right? That we sometimes want to know, actually not sometimes, but a lot of the time, we want to know evidence that we didn't already have in hand, right? That we want to find the counterfactual. We want to find evidence that we might be wrong.
If you're a good person. as I tell
if you're a strenuous scientist.
As I tell my class, like, if I'm a good pollster, and by a good pollster, I mean a bad pollster, I can get any answer you want. And I think that this is the grappling, right? And this is why the overall trust in science and trust in polling is so important, because, like, I give examples in my class where I'm like, here are two questions asking about the Green New Deal. Can you tell me which one's pro and which one's con? And they load up the question in different ways. And so, like, it is the case that, if you want me to give you a number that supports your side and I'm a good pollster, which I am, I can get you that number, right? But that's like the illusion of learning. That's not polling anymore, right? That's not being motivated by the truth. That's trying to almost like use polling
as advertising,
which unfortunately is now done, right? There's like push polls, and there's even talking about whether or not pollsters themselves are kind of trying to release polls to shape the media landscape by showing one candidate up versus another candidate. And so, like, and that's like not good, right? For those of us who kind of use polling to try to learn something about democracy, but it's also probably not good writ large, because, like, once we lose that ability to kind of, or that trust, right, in the work that's being done, then, like, on what basis do we have to evaluate claims about the truth, right? And so, like, if I can't trust anything, then it's like, then everyone's opinion becomes their own truth. And then that's really hard to do anything to make any kind of agreement.
Right.
And so so I think, like, having humility about what you're doing and say, look, I could screw this thing up. I've got lots of errors. Like, I just think that's, like, important to be honest, right? Because, like, science is so messy. Right. And we know that throughout history, science makes mistakes sometimes, but, like, at the end of the day, like, it's incumbent upon, and again, like, this is, we try to do replication, all this stuff. We try to do all this stuff as scientists, or try to, like, protect against that. But foundationally, it really, there's limits to what you can do, right? It's basically up to the goodness of the people involved, to do the right thing.
Right. And I hear you using the word good in two ways. Good as in super skilled, right? Like, you're a good pollster or you're a good political scientist, meaning you have the chops. But then the other version of the good, which is like, I really am trying to get closer to an answer that is verifiable, transparent, credible, and replicable, right?
Yeah. I mean, you have to be, like, both skillful and moral in some ways, right? And, like,
really interesting.
So I don't know.
Skillful, moral. And then the thing I wanted to ask you, Josh, is skillful, moral, and presumably relatively shielded in either having or expressing your own views personally, right? Like, you're teaching a class, what is it, Vanderbilt's largest class ever?
Yep.
So you're teaching a class on the U.S. presidential election. Yep. Surely at least half of the class wanted to know who you supported, right? How did you handle that? I make it a point so that my goal is that no one knows what I think about, because it's not my goal to tell my students what to think. I do want to equip them with the skills so they know how to think, if that makes sense, but, like, not how to think about, like, I'm going to support this team or that team, but kind of like, how do I make reasoned assessments of the data and kind of come to my own conclusions? I think that's the most critical thing. And because, people come from different places, people have different experiences in terms of what they do, and college should not be about me telling you what to think, right? It should be kind of me equipping you with the tools that you can navigate the world, and you can understand the world, and you can make the world as you understand it kind of, and come to your own kind of conclusions. And so, like, teaching the elections class with 1,100 people, like, that's a terrific challenge, right? Because, you want, and, like, especially in our political climate, like, I was frankly unclear how that would, because we have, like, 1 out of every 6 Vanderbilt students in, and they're all networked on Fizz or whatever crazy social media things are in. And so, like, if that class goes sideways, right? The whole, it's going to have, like, large repercussions. And it's like, I was joking with my parents, like, my definition of success for the semester, if I don't end up on MSNBC or Fox News for things kind of going, awry in class, which, knock on wood, we haven't done that so far. So, I mean, but it's so important, I think, for you to be able to share that, because I think the kind of notion of being really, really smart and really questioning and really undeclared in your own views and yet hyper declared in your commitment to doing the work to have a viewpoint and to do it in an empirically or, intellectually rigorous way. That's a lot to try to communicate to students, right?
Yeah, but it's also important, because it's like, we've been having similar different debates for like hundreds and hundreds of years, right? And so, and people, and I think the most important thing is like, how do you get that skill so you can interact with one another? And so like, I still foundationally think like everyone kind of wants the same, right? Everyone wants the same thing, right? And there's disagreements about how best to achieve that good thing, right? And that's an enduring problem in society. It's always been a problem in society. And so as a person, as a professor, like my job is not to tell you what the good thing is, right? Or kind of what necessarily the right policy is, because, I'll leave that to the economists, but they still can't figure that out. but that's a whole other conversation. But it's kind of to equip you, right, with the capacity that you can understand some of the arguments that are being put in front of you. And especially in this data-driven world where both sides are mobilizing arguments and data to kind of, you need to have the capacity to kind of understand what that means or what, how to interpret that and kind of update. And do I change my opinions? Like, how much do I weigh this versus that? And that's, watching that journey that students take. That's part of my, I do all this public facing and scholarship, but literally the favorite parts of the job is like in the classroom, like when I'm teaching something and I see just the light bulbs go on, right? And it's like, that's why like teaching data science and statistics, like everything, that's a horrible class. But no, it's a beautiful class because like you're teaching someone how to think and how to process data. And when you see that they finally understand, or hopefully quicker, because I think I'm sometimes a good teacher, but when you see them that understanding come across, right, then that's like, that makes my day.
Golden moment.
It's a golden moment because then you realize that I don't know if I want to say changed your life, but you have kind of changed, you've changed the toolkit that they have for navigating this complex world. Yeah. And you've empowered them to kind of go off and kind of make sense of the world in really foundationally, important work. And so, my papers are good and they're good, and they're cited and blah, 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 blah. But like at the end of the day, like, it's somewhat like academic is very humbling, right? And again, because like everyone I read in grad school, and I'm sure the same is like no one reads them anymore, right? Yeah. To some exception, but like all that, we spend your entire life on trying to hit the top journals, and you realize that, but that's like in such an ephemeral thing.
Completely.
But the impact you have on a student, right? And so like working my grad students and having them go off and kind of, taking an assistant professor job at Yale this year or University of Michigan, or kind of seeing my undergrads get into these kind of amazing and seeing their lives literally change before your eyes. Like that is kind of, that's like the most remarkable thing. And it's also that
super amazing feeling that, whether the paper's ever cited again is unknown and as you said, super ephemeral, right? And you sort of, if it's missed, no problem, because it wasn't that amazing in the first place. It was great to see the paper come out, but the real work had happened years before, right? And that the real work is actually those graduate students and those undergrads who are now doing exponentially more cool work in the next iteration. And that they're training students who are doing exponentially more cool work in the next iteration, right? Yeah. It's in that way that you've built human capital that's starting to really ripple. And I'm really curious about the way that you build human capital nationally with the public, right? I love that phrase that you just said, that you are building a student's toolkit, or that you're expanding their toolkit to be able to think differently or think, more sort of rigorously about the things that they really care about, but don't necessarily know how to navigate. Do you feel like the public is getting better or more sophisticated or more sharp in its thinking? Is that translational effort landing with the American voting public or the voting and non-voting public? I think that there's increasing opportunities for that to happen. Is my kind of like nuanced answer to that, but I think it is happening in places, and I think that's really vital. And I think it's largely because of the way the media landscape has been disrupted. Now that has good and bad consequences, but like I remember like some of the polling pieces I wrote this cycle trying to explain like why polling could get different answers, or why the polls were all kind of giving the same answers in ways that were not super great, or why everyone was, so I had like a million, this is like the other crazy, like I wrote a paper on early voting and why you should just like take a walk instead of reading it. And it got like 1 million views on NBC News, right? Because again, people want that certainty. And I was like, you're not going to get that here. Right. Like the data is not going to tell you what
you want to tell. But trying to like have conversations with like the network news to kind of like have that conversation, they weren't really interested in it because like it's right. It's this great
because they want the certainty.
Well, because you want certainty, right? And so, like I said, instead of releasing polls like multiple numbers, you should have like you should with one number you should have multiple numbers because like that reflects our uncertainty there. But then that muddies it, and that gives the impression that we can't really say anything, which is the reality, right? You can't say anything about Pennsylvania.
And maybe some
right?
other channel is selling a simpler
explanation
product, right? But, just go with one number. This is the number here.
Exactly, but I have to think. Right, that is like short-sighted in the long run because like with that, and you see this across the board, right? People have no trust in in institutions writ large, right? And I think it's because people are like, that doesn't make any sense or that's wrong. And I think, I don't know, I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. Like you can be honest in the sense that intellectually that there's, we think this is the case, right? But there's uncertainty about that. And instead of saying this is the truth, right? Well, science is right? As you know, it's an ever evolving achievement towards the truth, but you can never prove anything. You can only rule hypotheses out, right? And so it's like, it's nuanced.
And I love that because it's the flip version of you saying about yourself that you really value your own or you value humility and the importance of it for yourself. You're also clearly talking about valuing the public's intelligence, right? You're treating the public, you're treating those individuals who are saying, oh, is this the number or is it a different number? Which single variable should I look at? And you're saying, I trust you to actually hold on to two numbers at once or to recognize that it might be a useful proxy, but it's not completely right. That, the path forward to building trust in institutions is treating people as if they can be thoughtful. And can use the skills and the tools that you're giving them.
Yeah, and meeting them where they are, right, and then kind of valuing and say they have a useful perspective, and not everyone is as fortunate as I to have kind of taken the path that I have taken, but that doesn't mean that those other people, but for a few chances, like I would have a very different world, and so it's like. You see yourself and you see, and it's not, that sounds elitist, but it's not, it's basically empowering like normal people. Like it's not just academics who should be making decisions, but everyone has the same capacity. And I think if you gave everyone the opportunity, they could all be, successful. So they're kind of respecting, right, the intelligence of the people and kind of treating them with respect. And, and sometimes there's disagreements and sometimes people see data differently and they have different interpretations. And that's,
Is your lab pretty heated? Is your research team is there lots of flaring up of very different strong opinions, or do all of your students tend to use the same sort of like the best outcome here is if you don't know my political views and you only know that I have really great stats chops?
It's interesting, right? Because like there has been a shift, right, in terms of the propensity of people to put their political views out there, and so like. I'm now recognizing myself as an old person, right? Which is crazy to me because I still feel like I'm in grad school and I have no freaking idea what I'm doing. But like I look around the faculty, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I'm an old person. Like I am like, I'm far away from the research frontier. But this is something I navigate and like I honestly don't know, right?
Okay, for the record, just for everyone listening, Josh Clinton is not, in my view, categorizable as an old person. But that said, keep going.
But so like I know as I talking to one of my students and like they were taking political views, for example, right, on social media, and I was like, I'm just it's like I'm not sure that's a great thing for you to do. But they say, well, I feel that this is important to me to do this.
Yes.
And it's like, okay, well, I'm not telling you not to do that, right? Here's my perspective. I respect your perspective because people have difference of opinions. Like I don't do that, but like, you're an independent person, right? You can come to your own assessment of what's going on. And so like, so some people do that, right? And I'm totally like you be you, right? It's kind of, people have different impressions and I'm not going to say silence you if you feel important to speak it. I don't think that's what I do, but like, I totally respect people kind of who do. And I think it's navigating, that it's complicated and it's, and I don't know what the right answer, I don't know what the right answer is. Right. And so it's,
Well, it's just interesting because you're in a role of authority where you actually have a lot of sway or impact because your opinion or the credibility of your assessment is going to be put out there on national news. Right. And so in many ways, your neutrality is central to the effectiveness of your ability to do that. Whereas the student is building the capacity to express their views, learning how to express those views and sharpening that capacity. And maybe the student needs to do that by expressing his or her or their views a lot, right? And so it may be a difference of position and role.
And I'm also so grateful I didn't grow up in social media, right? Where I could make mistakes, right? And do things that I probably ought not have done, right? But there's no record,
right.
With my son, like, he was like doing, it's like we had that conversation super early, like whatever you do, it's permanent, right? And that's really bad because like you're a kid, you're stupid, right? I mean, you make bad decisions sometimes, right?
It's a function of the prefrontal cortex not being fully developed.
It's not your fault,
right.
but how do you get that humility, make a mistake, but then I can improve or kind of recognize that was a mistake. And so it's, it's complicated, but this point is something that I navigate because it's like, living in Tennessee, like it is a Republican state, right? And I do polling and I'm from Vanderbilt University and I'm academic. And so people say, well, you're a liberal, Democrat. And so, and that's disarming from the fact because, regardless of whether that's true or not, right? That what I say then is taken as like, well, because you're this,
yes,
I can't trust what you say about whatever you're saying. And it's particularly poignant for political science, right? Because people think political science is politics and it's not quite the same, although sometimes there, in some parts of the discipline, there is a little bit of that. But to the extent that you can't communicate like across the aisle and communicate truths about, right? Then that's like not great because like if you're only speaking to people who you think agree with you or they think they agree with you, then it's like, then you're not really having that full conversation. You're not really having that full impact or kind of.
I mean, right. You don't get access to the data for one thing, right? To the perspective, but also being misattributed in terms of your own, how you're viewed may mean, that they miss out on the opportunity also, right? They've just foreshortened the amount of information they can learn from you because they've made some assumptions about who you are or what you stand for. Yeah. It's really fascinating. The idea that it just limits the amount of information exchange. Yeah.
And, it makes you, it limits your impact. Not that I, cared that much about like my impact, shaping the world or whatever, but also like the interactions that you have and your ability to kind of learn about the world. Right. And so like, I think you just have to, keep an open mind with respect to kind of perspectives and experiences and kind of, engage people again, where they are and try to not, let those, especially in the world that we live in, people put on blinders and they make presuppositions about people and then they don't update.
Yeah,
and I
totally.
think that's a horrible thing, right? Because the whole thing about is like you need to be willing to kind of engage, change your mind, have conversations. And if we're not doing that, then I'm not sure what we're doing, right? Because like the whole human story is about encountering people and kind of interact with one another and kind of building society and building cultures together, right? And that requires, that kind of interpersonal contact and not just saying, well, I'm not going to talk to you because like you're wearing a different color hat.
Yeah. I mean, I love that idea of continuous updating. It totally works. And I guess that's where it leads me for the last question I'd love to ask you, Josh, which is where do you think polling and surveying is going? If it's only 2%, those that you actually speak with represent such a tiny fraction of those you intend to represent with the numbers that you want to generate or yield. Is there some AI/technologically, enabled future that allows us some cool way of, other than liking or hearting a live stream on Instagram, like what's the thing that will eventually solve this problem?
I mean, that's a super great question. And if I knew the answer, I'd probably be building my own company rather than talking with you. So I think there's two things. One is like, it's not great, right? But even said, it's kind of remarkable if you think about it, that I can talk to 800 people and get within like 4 points of the margin on an election with hundreds of millions of votes.
Yeah.
Right. And so like, that's kind of like mind blowing, like even given all the problems we talked about. Right. And so that's like, a statement about readjusting expectations about what we can plausibly do given the coarseness of the signal and instruments that are available to us, right? So I think
I love that phrase, the coarseness of the signal.
Yeah. So I think that we have to do that to some extent, but then technology changes too. And so like my colleagues and I at Vanderbilt, like, we looked at this like, AI, artificial intelligence. Some people I did, well, I don't need to talk to people anymore. I'll just talk to AI. Right. And kind of will simulate respondents and see what they think and how well you do. And some people are doing this for trying to predict the election. And, that can do something, but again, you have to realize what you're doing, right? And so people don't really fully understand AI and LLMs because like what that's just doing is like, I'm ingesting all the internet content and trying to find associations there. And so again, is the people on Reddit, right, or on YouTube comments, are they really reflective of American public? Right? Probably not, right? So there's biases there. And so how do you adjust that?
Yeah.
And so you can get close, right? If you do AI and you do all this other stuff that people are trying to do, but for the fine grained precision, it's kind of complicated. The other thing is it kind of bakes in the past, right? And so like if you're trying to predict something using internet data, given how quickly the world changes, the only way you can get an updated, forecast if people change their minds turns out by talking to them, right? I can't sample the internet from the past and say, well, based on this, I suspect this will happen in the future. And so I think there are some promising things that are being done to try to, in some sense, also make it more engaging because like, it's really hard to reach people. So how we shorten that experience and kind of make it more interactive, although I'm not sure AI chatbots solve that because having, communicate with them on financial websites, they're a disaster.
Yeah.
Or a healthcare site that's
totally. Or if I received one more text that told me to respond to the survey, right? There was absolutely no way.
Yeah. So I think that's like an ongoing project to kind of, figure that out. And I think some of it will be technological and methodological, but then also I hope, right, some of that would just be better used to kind of understand like, what can we learn from the data? But that's something that's true all over. Like all these claims about AI is going to revolutionize the world. Like maybe, but like all these companies rushing in to do these decisions without fully understanding like the biases
what's
and
behind the curtain.
What's behind the curtains and kind of how does that affect the conclusions that are being made, I think are so foundationally important, right? And like polling is like an easier version to understand than where we are going in kind of in the future. And so I think that just shows that increasing that literacy among the public at large about statistics and kind of data.
Right. It's only a butter knife, but a butter knife is something you can actually hold in your hand and you know what it looks like and you know how it works, right? Yeah,
and it can still do damage. And it can do damage if wielded the wrong way, right? So a surgeon can use it, but like if a bad person has it, like they can also, so like understanding the tools and kind of the limitations of these tools, I think is something real important. That's, and that's like every single day teaching these classes at Vanderbilt and seeing and empowering the students for the future, like grad students or undergrads, like, I get so much joy out of that. So much fun, more fun than respond to a review or two about some paper that, will be impactful in my field, but, may not go much beyond that. And so it always keeps you busy because the world's always changing and there's always something new to kind of talk about and hopefully explain and complexify in appropriate ways so that we have an appreciative understanding of kind of exactly how certain are we about the things we're talking about. Because science is not only about numbers, but it's also quantifying our uncertainty. And I don't think we do that enough to really get people the sense.
I like that so much as a landing spot, right? That it's not just about estimating a number. It's about quantifying our uncertainty. That, you're admitting to uncertainty, which I think we as scientists and
sometimes
scholars,
hard to do.
Sometimes
I'm not perfect.
Well, we're rewarded for being both critical and confident, right? And so the idea that we would be rewarded for or reward each other and be recognized for quantifying our uncertainty alongside quantifying what we are certain about and also creatively interested in for the future. That's a really hopeful and really sanguine place to land. Any last words, Josh? Any last thoughts in terms of your advice to the United States as we think about democracy in 2028?
I just say, it's a process, right? I mean, democracy has always been a process. One of the books I've recently read, that's a false. I bought it with the intention of reading. It's on my bookshelf. I haven't read it yet, but it's about, I think it's like The Sunshine of the Setting Sun or something like that by a historian at Syracuse University. And it's an interesting book that goes through and talks to all the people who wrote the founding fathers who wrote the Constitution and what they were thinking at the end of their time. And like to a person, they all thought the United States was a failure.
Wow.
Right? Because like all the things, factions and parties, like everything they didn't want manifested, right?
Yes.
And it looked, when they were dying, said, there's no way this country, we are a complete failure. We spent our entire life building this country and it's coming apart at the seams, like, it's going to be horrible. And I think, well, geez, like if Madison and Washington and Jefferson, they all were kind of like really despondent about the United States.
Things looked bleak then.
And yet, right? And yet, here we are, right? And it's not to say things are perfect, right? There's like problems that need to be solved and whatever. But like if the people design the system at the very outset, and it's a very different world then, to be clear, right? But if they were all despondent about it, right? Then like, I'm not saying that normalizes despondency, but it kind of normalizes, like, this is just like, it's like, government is hard, right? Yeah. Politics is hard.
What we're doing is really difficult and really exciting.
So you have to like engage with that, with the knowing that, it's with also the humility that it is hard, right? You're going to fail. You're going to take steps, that, don't go in the direction that you want, or that go in the direction you want for a short period of time. And, it's just like, that's what kind of makes it quasi interesting to see how we bring together these different perspectives to try to make, for many one. And the kind of that's an ongoing project, and it's always going to be an ongoing project. There's never going to be a complete solution.
Thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Remember to stay curious and keep exploring new ideas. We'll be back next time with another guest who's pushing the boundaries of discovery. Until then, I'm Cybele Raver, and this is Quantum Potential.
The Quantum Potential Podcast comes from Vanderbilt University. Your host is Cybele Raver. Thank you to our guest, Josh Clinton. Production by Matriarch Digital Media. For more information about quantum potential, go to vanderbilt.edu/quantum potential. Stay curious.